Every morning Alberto went to work with great joy, because he was doing what he had dreamed of since he was a child. I read a lot of medical literature and was immersed in science even before I went to college. Since he could remember, he always believed that he would heal and save people, so as soon as he obtained his medical degree, the next day he was already working in the city hospital. The promising young surgeon accepted enthusiastically and never regretted it. From the first day he proved to be a qualified surgeon, and a year later it was no longer easy to go to him for an operation. Everyone was literally begging to be assigned to Albert Perez for the operation. He, for his part, was willing to work literally day and night, for himself and for his colleagues. Everyone knew that Albert was a confirmed bachelor, so he gladly agreed to spend his free time doing the job he loved. Almost everyone on the team respected this intelligent, kind and likable surgeon. He was always willing to help and advise on anything. When it came to patients, he cared for each one with heart and soul. If it was a particularly complicated operation, he wouldn't leave the hospital for the whole of the next day until he was sure the patient was okay. At 35 years old, Alberto was already a well-known doctor in the city, having saved more than a dozen lives. His former patients included drivers and school principals, milkmaids, and teachers. He didn't care about rank, status, or titles. He fought for everyone's life in the same way, and he did everything possible, and sometimes impossible, to help his patients. If Alberto got what he wanted in his career, his personal life didn't change. He was considered an enviable guy, and many girls took notice of the regal brunette. He was a handsome man, 6 feet tall, with a very pleasant, velvety voice. One of the patients came to say, "Alberto Perez, you can treat patients without a scalpel or drugs. As soon as I hear your voice, all my ailments disappear." To which the doctor smiled and answered jokingly, "Isabel, if it helps you get rid of your hernia without surgery, I would even sing at your bedside. In the meantime, let's take her blood pressure, see the tests and prepare for the meeting in the operating room." In addition to his renowned gift for surgery, he had the gift of easy communication. Alberto knew how to convince, reassure and motivate patients so that they would agree to any operation with complete peace of mind. Everyone was confident of a speedy recovery and had full confidence in the doctor. Knowing that Alberto was willing to spend all his free time within the walls of his beloved institute, his colleagues often took advantage of it. They all knew they could ask him to fill in for them at any hour of the day or night and that he would be happy to do so when they were on duty. Pia Novia and Ana Garcia, the head nurses, often gossiped. Grandma Pia, as they called her in the pavilion, whispered to her friend, "What is she supposed to do at home alone between 4 walls? If you have a family, children." "Yes," Anna encouraged her, "at least here there is company." I sigh and continue, "I don't think she's ever been in love." But no one could know what was in the surgeon's past. He never shared it with anyone and it remained a secret to all the single beauties in the hospital. When Estela Fernandez, one of the doctors in the room, decided once again to take advantage of her kindness to him during the working day, he smiled and was the first to start a conversation. "Let me guess, will he have to take over the night watch?" She knew that Estela's husband worked as a truck driver and that when he passed by unexpectedly, she had already asked him several times for a substitute, knowing that Alberto would not refuse. "Thank you, my savior. You are the best colleague and friend in the world. When you get married, I am ready to take care of all your shifts so that you and your beloved can spend the honeymoon." Estela stammered happily and immediately disappeared, giving her a kiss on the cheek. They had maintained a very cordial relationship since they had arrived at the hospital at the same time after college. Alberto had never been reluctant to help her, give her advice or replace her when she needed it. So this time too I finally accept, especially since duty promised to be quiet. The ICU was empty, no serious patients or scheduled operations were expected. All the exams and appointments had already been made, so it was safe to spend the night studying the new surgical supplies. After eating, Alberto went through all the rooms, made sure everything was in order, and went to the residence room. He spent so much time in the hospital that he even subscribed to the hospital magazines, and once a month he received Gaceta Medica, which he studied from cover to cover. In his free time, while having lunch, he immersed himself in the study of new developments and advances in medicine and dreamed of defending his thesis as soon as possible. After finishing reading another newspaper, Alberto had put on the kettle and was preparing to cheer himself up with a cup of coffee when the phone rang. He picked it up and listened. "Alberto, I present to you Leonore, the duty nurse of the gynecology service. We have a pregnant woman, age 27, with triplets. Without surgery, we need a caesarean section and your presence and advice." The hospital usually uses surgeons from other departments when it is necessary to operate, so Victor was not surprised and immediately responded, "I will be with you, preparing the patient and the operating room." Looking sadly at the boiling kettle, she unplugged the appliance and headed for the exit. Going up the stairs, where the gynecology room was, he was almost at the door with Nicholas, the doctor on duty for the gynecology ward. He spoke briefly about the patient. The woman was young, perfectly healthy, and the only difficulty was that 3 babies were going to be born at the same time. "I decided not to take the risk. I could have taken care of it myself, but in this case I had to operate. Forgive me for giving you a night job," Nicholas smiled. But Alberto, as always, had a simple answer. "What do you mean? I love my job and the job loves me. If not, my mother will have 3 children by herself, without our help." They quickly change and go to the maternity ward. As soon as Alberto saw the face of his acquaintance, he could hardly help but scream or, worse still, faint. Fortunately, his help was not needed at the time, otherwise he would not have been able to lift the instrument. While the anesthetist attended to his patient, Albert's thoughts traveled back in time. Once, when he was a student, he was madly in love. Albert had met his Caroline when he was at school. He came to visit his friend, a medical colleague, and was literally speechless when he saw the frail silhouette in the sunlight on the school porch. At that moment, Caroline seemed light and ethereal, not only in appearance but also in communication. She was short, with a long braid and sky-blue eyes, and she seemed to cast a spell on him from the first seconds. He started looking for all the possible and impossible ways to see her. Even his parents realized that their son had changed a lot. One day his mother couldn't stand him coming back late at night, humming happily, and asked him in a low voice, "Son, aren't you in love? Maybe we should prepare for the wedding, but we have no idea. At least introduce us to your beauty." Alberto affectionately hugged his mother, kissed her and suddenly, jokingly pushing her away, said, "And why not? I'll bring it tomorrow. So bake cakes and wait." Caroline panicked when she found out about the presentation. As she was a modest and shy girl, she timidly murmured, "Alberto, maybe we shouldn't do this yet. I'm afraid they won't like me. We don't know each other, and your parents are famous people in the city, and who am I?" In fact, the doctor's family was very famous in their city. His father was a senior doctor at a hospital. Now he is retired and works as a consultant in a private clinic. Albert's mother had worked for many years as the manager of the central pharmacy. Caroline, on the other hand, was from the country and her parents lived very modestly. His father and mother worked on the farm for a pittance, but housework was the real salvation. Faced with my beloved's hesitation, the boy merely smiled. "Caroline, how can you not like it? Don't make it up." He hugged her and whispered, "You'll see, they'll like me from the first minute, they'll love you, and I'm sure we'll get married." At that moment I could not imagine what would actually happen. The next day, their mother and father welcomed them with joy, but the joy was false. After half an hour of talk, after having learned everything she needed to know about the girl and her family, her mother asked Alberto to help her in the kitchen to organize tea. As soon as he entered, my mother began to mutter something angry. "Son, did we raise you for her, for this villager? Think about the future that awaits you. You can become a famous surgeon, and if a simpleton can be a worthy wife for such a man, understand it, it will only drag you down, it will not give you a chance to do science. In the early years you will have many children, and thoughts about medicine will turn into thoughts about where to earn money to support your family. You must know that your father and I are strongly opposed to such a daughter-in-law." "Mom, come, Caroline is a lovely girl, I love her, and you and Dad will like her in time, and now we are going to have tea. Let's hurry up with your delicious cake and cups." Alberto answered, picked up what his mother had put on the table and took it to the bedroom, making it clear that the conversation was over. But it was not like that. Since that day, every time he met his mother, she would pretend Caroline didn't exist, or convince her son to break up with the simpleton. After a while, Albert himself began to doubt whether they were right for each other. Fights and misunderstandings between him and her became more and more frequent. After another conflict, he cried and said, "After visiting your parents, it's like there was a cat locked up between us. You're always upset with something, like you're only looking for bad things about me. I can't go on like this, Alberto. Let's not see each other for a while so you can decide if you want what your mother says is a simpleton." He paused and added, "Your mom even found out where I work so she can come to my store and tell me what the future holds for you and how I'll get in your way. He said that a hick and simpleton like me's place is behind the counter, not in life by your side. So sorry, I can't go on with this." Alberto tried to stop her, but apparently not very convincingly, and she left. They never saw each other again. The next day he tried to find Caroline through his friend and at work, but everywhere he got the same answer: she had packed up her things and asked not to be looked for. Alberto kept looking for her for some time, but Caroline disappeared into thin air. He even thought that he had gone to his land to another city, but he did not know anything. Studying, graduating, and defending his degree took up so much of his time that he didn't even have time to sleep. Albert wanted to go to the town where Caroline's parents lived, but he didn't have time. Time passed, Albert graduated from university and got a job in a hospital, but thoughts about his beloved did not leave him. He tried to put the past behind him and even married one of his patients. From the first day in the hospital, Camila showed special attention to the young surgeon. Alberto had been working in the department for a year, and the persistent beauty achieved her goal. After her recovery and discharge, they began dating, and 6 months later she asked Alberto to marry her without problems, without knowing why. It couldn't be said that he didn't feel anything for Camila at all. There was a crush, which over time passed, but his soul was silent. Or rather, like his heart, he continued to love only Caroline. He decided not to have a noisy and pompous wedding with Camila. It was his second marriage, so he immediately said, "Honey, I don't need any more veil or white dress, let's go to a restaurant and relax somewhere." She agreed, as always in their relationship. Camila assumed control of all daily problems and their solutions, and was able to solve them without consulting Alberto. My mother and father welcomed my son's bright and active bride from the first meeting and agreed to the marriage from the first minutes, even though it had not even been discussed at the time. After taking Camila to the meeting, my mother called her son to help her, apparently with the tea. He whispered happily, unlike other times when they were in the kitchen, "Son, this is your destiny, God has sent you so much happiness, as if it were a sign. Smart, spectacular, promising. Get married immediately, she is your destiny." In fact, Camila was a promising financier, a deputy bank manager. A gorgeous blonde with gorgeous shoulder-length curls, a slender figure, and luscious facial features made many men turn their heads when they saw her pass. This time his mother's word did not give him respite, and he convinced Alberto to register the marriage without fuss, followed by dinner in a small but cozy restaurant. The celebration took place in a small circle. Camilla's parents worked abroad and said they would congratulate the young couple on their arrival. At the party were Albert's parents, who smiled happily when they saw their son, and several friends of the couple. After the wedding, at Camilla's insistence, they almost immediately went to the sea, but already their Albert did not like the way she flirted with men at every opportunity. "Just kidding about it, Albert, I just want to make you jealous and feel passionate. It doesn't matter who I smile at, what matters is who I run to bed with at night, and that's you, my good man." In those moments, Alberto thought that if someone dared to pay attention to Caroline, he would kill anyone, and with Camilla he felt quite uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because in his presence she easily allowed herself to forget that he existed and began to chat with another man, to smile at him, to dance with him, while her husband seemed to remain distant. But Alberto felt neither jealousy nor love. At first there was passion, but it faded over time. For a year and a half, their married life passed normally. Have breakfast in the morning, say good morning, work, have dinner at home or sometimes in a restaurant. But as time went by, Camila stayed at work longer and longer and returned after midnight more and more frequently. Alberto began to suspect that his wife had a lover, but strangely nothing stirred in his heart. He began to think more often about his first love, Caroline. Looking back on her married life with Camilla often, she saw that she had grown from a loyal and devoted wife to a public figure, giving interviews to local newspapers and magazines as the wife of an up-and-coming surgeon. Whoever came home late always had an answer. "Well, Alberto, it is impossible for the wife of a doctor like you not to be dressed up and pretty. So I went to the salon to get a spa and ran to the store to buy something new. By the way, Finance Day is coming up and I may have to go to a date or a company function. So I'm ready." She stretched out her hand to kiss her husband, but he, fed up with all the fuss and lying talk, waved his hand and retired to his room. He thought a lot about the divorce and thought more and more about Caroline. "I saw her everywhere, on the street, in transport, and even saw her in her sleep at night." When his wife's insolence pushed him to the limit, and sometimes she wasn't home even at night, Alberto decided to ask for a divorce. Camila didn't want to have children, so everything was quick and painless. By this time, the ex-wife had already found a rich businessman and, without hiding her disdain for the divorce, said, "I thought you were a star and that you would be in that clinic in the city. Sorry, I have other plans for my life. Bye. Good luck." Alberto finally saw his ex-girlfriend without masks or deceit, and he even seemed relieved. Now he could search for his beloved Caroline with a clear conscience. He even knew who would help him in this. There were so many experts in different fields among the lives saved by the surgeon that it was enough to rummage through the business cards left behind with a contact request and any problem could be solved. Alberto tried not to take advantage of it, but this time he couldn't do without the help of a professional. The surgeon recalled that he had recently operated on a detective from a private agency. They had brought him with suspicion of appendicitis and the appendix had already burst in the emergency room, and if it hadn't been for Alberto Sanchez, who was on duty, we didn't know if the detective would have survived or not. The operation was very complicated and obviously the chances of life were not 100%, but the experienced surgeon quickly revived Andre, who was called that. As a former policeman, Andre is known for his ability to extract information from the ground. Andre had participated in several combat operations and he kept joking around the room. The bullets passed over him, but an intestinal inflammation took him to the hospital. But now, in addition to battle scars, there was also a simple one, so to speak, from everyday life. He was grateful to the doctor, and now it was time to ask for the promised help, and the detective gladly accepted the surgeon's call. "Sanchez, how happy I am to hear from you. 100 times thanks for my life, what can I do for you?" They arranged to meet at a nearby cafe, where the doctor told her of his desire to find his former lover. You see, I was a fool at the time. It seemed that surgery had a great future. I needed to gain more and more knowledge, and then it turned out that I needed to get married, and Caroline really wanted children. Kind mommy and daddy sat on my ears, which were also too rustic, all huddled together and me wobbling. Then he disappeared. I got a new job, everything spun like a whirlwind. I even got married, hoping to forget the past, but it wasn't that easy. In my mind, I know that I have not forgotten or fallen out of love for a minute. I can't live without her. Every day I remember her. Help me find her, even if I don't know where. Andre took all the necessary information and promised to help my savior. He only asked me when he left. He hasn't gone to town. Maybe he's living at his parents' house and doesn't suspect anything. Alberto swallowed saliva and said, "No." I'm embarrassed to admit it, but in the year we met, I never knew where he was from. He only knew that he came from the countryside, from some almost abandoned town. I went to the rented flat where she lived, but the landlady didn't know anything about her. He didn't show up for work either. So I checked. Now I had to keep looking. Andre shook hands with the surgeon and told him that he was sure that he would find his beloved. From time to time he called the doctor to clarify some details and keep him informed. Every time I let him know if I discovered something new. One day Andre called and said that we had to see each other. Everything seemed to freeze in the soul of the man and he could not wait for the appointed hour. Excited, he arrived at the cafe where they had met long before the agreed time and was already finishing his third cup of green tea when the detective appeared. He sat down at the table and asked the waiter to bring coffee. Where is he? What's wrong with him? Alberto began after a pause. Please tell me, is he okay? I don't care if she's married or not, as long as she's alive and well. It was as if he sensed something, his heart clenched and he didn't let go. It was obvious that Andre was having a hard time starting this conversation. He took a few sips of coffee and handed him the envelope. When Alberto took the photo, the first image was a memorial with a profile of his dear Caroline with the dates of birth and death. To find it. A silly car accident took the life of your loved one. She is buried in one of the cemeteries. The number of the address of the place where she lies is on the back of the photo. Andre said that Carolina was on her way to work that day and was standing at the bus stop waiting for transportation. The drunk driver lost control and crashed into the bus stop at full speed. It was early in the morning and there were not many people. 2 were unharmed. A girl went to the hospital with a concussion and her Caroline was the first on the road and died instantly from her injuries. Only one thought passed through the doctor's mind at that moment: why her love? That day in the cafe, it seemed to Alberto that his last chance to be happy, to love, was now firmly buried under that stone slab with the profile of his beloved. He no longer remembered how long he had been sitting or how Andre had left. The tears seemed endless. In the morning she bought a huge bouquet of white roses and went to the cemetery. We have met, my love, Alberto said in a low voice, placing the roses on the headboard dash. This is not how I imagined our meeting. Forgive me, darling, I dreamed of making up for the guilt of my youth, but God and time have decided otherwise. Forgive me if you can, I still want you alone. He was sitting in the cemetery for hours, until the watchman approached him and asked him, "Are you okay? Need help?" As if she had come to her senses, she headed for the exit. Alberto was in his bitter thoughts when he heard a piteous hiss alternated with another coming from the garbage cans at the exit of the cemetery. 2 scruffy dogs cornered a small red-haired kitten and tried to scratch it with their claws. If they had been so close, they would have torn the little boy to pieces, but Alberto quickly came to his aid. He picked up a stick from the ground and brandished it threateningly against the mestizos. "Come on, let's get out of here. 2 against a boy." The dogs immediately scattered, while the red bundle started, its eyes flashing, as if it didn't know what to do. Alberto lifted the kitten from the ground and said in a low voice, "Well, my friend, this must be how Caroline leaves me a memory of herself. After all, you are just as helpless as she once was. Come on, let's go home. I will wash you and feed you, and you will be my friend. That's what I'm going to call you, by the way." Alberto Sanchez, it's your turn to help. Nicholas brought him back to reality. Alberto, a true professional, knew how to control his emotions and performed the operation perfectly. 2 children and their little sister were born. When Alberto returned to the living room that night, he couldn't sleep a wink. The painfully familiar face of the woman in labor was before her eyes. He wanted so badly to believe that mistakes like that were possible, and that there was a chance that his beloved was alive. It was possible, he thought at the time, that something had happened to cause an entirely different girl to be buried here in the cemetery, and not his Caroline. But then why didn't she recognize him? Maybe she just didn't want to find out, since he had betrayed her once. In the morning he decided to go back to the gynecology service, supposedly to see how the patient and the babies were doing, but decided to look at the records himself. The data of the young mother did not coincide with that of her beloved. His last name and first name were different, and under relatives there were dashes. I was an orphan. He stood with the card in his hands and couldn't understand how it was possible that 2 people so different from each other could look alike in such a way. At that moment Nicholas entered the office. "Oh, mate, it's almost dawn and you're up. Don't worry, everything is fine with mommy and the babies. We're doing a good job, so we have the right to have a coffee. I'm on my own," he continued with a wink, "because without you I wouldn't have accepted all 3 so quickly." They went to the ground floor of the hospital, where there was a buffet, and spent half an hour talking about everything. When Alberto returned to the living room, his thoughts were still revolving around motherhood. Everything else came to mind. He even thought that Caroline might have had a twin sister. They may have been separated as children. For example, the parents, who could not raise 2 at the same time, one, for example, could have remained in the maternity hospital. It even crossed his mind to tamper there or steal one of the babies. When he returned home that day, not even faithful Buddy recognized his master. Alberto entered thoughtful, self-absorbed. She hadn't poured the usual milk into Buddy's bowl, but just rubbed it down and walked into the room. She only remembered the pet when she saw it, as smart as it seemed, scurrying across the floor with its empty food bowl. "Oh, well, I know, I forgot. I'm sorry, dear friend, let's make it up to you," said the owner and went to the kitchen. "There's milk for Buddy," he added. "Forgive me other headaches, I owe you milk and sweets." Buddy rubbed gratefully at his master's feet as if delighted by the change in mood. Alberto sometimes felt that he understood him, and on his way home from work he often spoke to him. That night, despite his tiredness, the doctor did not sleep much. He was awake waiting for the morning. After much deliberation, he decided that in the first free minute of the next working day he would go to yesterday's parturient and try to find out everything. He couldn't continue living in ignorance and speculation, that would make him lose his mind. In the morning he could hardly wait for the weekly briefing. He made the rounds of his patients and immediately hurried upstairs. Alberto, trying to calm his excitement, stepped into the room on cotton paws. The girl seemed asleep, but she opened her eyes immediately when she heard the footsteps. "Good morning, how are you? My name is Alberto Sanchez, I am a surgeon and yesterday I attended your delivery. By the way, congratulations on the birth of your precious triplets," he smiled, not knowing how to continue the conversation. Sylvia, that was the name of the patient, spoke happily. "Thank you very much, I don't remember, I was anesthetized, but today I saw the babies." "Thanks again." Confused, Alberto said, "You're welcome." Feel better. All the set words flew out of the doctor's mind at the sight of facial features so familiar and still so beloved. He was about to leave, but suddenly he stopped, turned around and asked, "Sylvia, do you happen to have a sister?" The girl's face changed, she seemed scared or surprised and asked in a low voice, "How did you know?" He had a twin sister, but she died about 7 years ago. An accident, or rather a traffic accident. Alberto sat in a chair next to the bed and, seeing that she was about to cry, he tried to calm her down. "Please, don't worry, you can't. Tell me about yourself. Please tell me about you and your sister, I really need it." After a while of silence, Sylvia began to tell me in a low voice how many years ago, when her father had died, the three of them had stayed in a remote village, in an old house inherited from her grandmother. His mother was always sick, there was no work, just a small farm. They had a cow, a couple of pigs, and a dozen chickens. It was after school that Caroline, Sylvia's sister, couldn't bear to be poor, as she said, and went to the city to work. We had a big fight before my sister left. I felt sorry for my mother because at that moment my sister seemed to think only of herself and not of her. Only later, after he died, did I realize that he wanted to do something for all of us. Caroline sent money regularly. But we never got in touch, which I regretted for a long time. The girl was silent and remained with her back to the wall for a while, then she continued. I knew that my sister had gotten a job in the city as a shop assistant, and even that she had a boyfriend in the city, but that didn't matter to me at that moment. My mother was getting worse, cancer rarely allows anyone to survive, but I hoped I could help her. I had to sell all my animals, I didn't have time to take care of them anyway, and I needed money for medicines for my mother. But life treated our family differently. It turned out that my mother was also a Caroline survivor. Tears ran slowly down Sylvia's cheeks, who kept talking and talking, as if she wanted to speak out loud. The news of Caroline's death was like a knife to the heart, and Mom began to turn pale before my eyes. 6 months later, I also buried her. God, at that moment I thought that I would not survive what was happening, and I was so lost. She was alone in the world and didn't know how to go on living. The girl remained silent again, and Alberto was afraid to look into her eyes. After all, he was a guy and a traitor to the city who had traded love for a career. But he couldn't admit it. That day Sylvia spoke for a long time, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Alberto found out that, after the death of his mother and sister, Sylvia was left alone in an old and dilapidated house in a town where there was little life. Once large and beautiful, with a school, a store and a farm, it had become an abandoned village with 10 houses and a caravan that came several times a week. Good thing there was a bus to the district center twice a day, and Sylvia found a job there. He would get up at 4 in the morning to catch the bus in half an hour and run back at 6 in the evening. The market where he got the job didn't pay much, but he had enough to live on. But it seemed that the death of loved ones was not the only thing that life had in store for the woman. One day he came home from work and saw only burnt logs and the kitchen chimney. Most likely, unburned coal had fallen through the poorly closed kitchen hatch, which was enough for a rusty old house. So Sylvia's past life burned down with the house, and she was forced to leave the village. In the city he almost immediately rented a small room on the outskirts, as far as his savings allowed. The room was in a communal apartment with 2 other neighbors. One of them was a small, but quite agile grandmother. Her name was Camila Rodriguez. She was very happy when she found out who the new tenant would be. What a joy for me in my old age, we will have 2 relatives, and now we will spend the afternoon having tea. I couldn't talk to my old roommate, she was drunk, then asleep, and in the other rooms there were tenants, then not. That's it, that's enough for now, and then we'll think of something else. At that moment Sylvia was about to cry, the old woman looked so familiar to her. The reason was not the household utensils she had brought, but her special care, not as if she were a stranger. They began to really take care of each other as close people. Sylvia almost immediately got a job at a nearby grocery store as a clerk and always tried to serve the kind-hearted neighbor by buying enough groceries for both of them. Having lost her grandmother at a very young age and having no one close to her, Sylvia immediately developed a kindred feeling for her. And her grandmother bonded with her right away. God has given him no grandchildren of his own, and his only son was an officer, serving somewhere far to the north. He came very little, but helped his mother regularly. Camila Rodriguez often remembered her son with a kind of sadness in her voice and reproached her daughter-in-law for her few visits. No, he liked to talk about it a lot, but one night he did it openly. My son David is as gullible as a heifer, he did not marry until he was 30. Before, he used to come every vacation, but when that girl showed up, he started sending money, but he only came once and told me that his wife couldn't go on vacation. No, I'm not offended, it's something juvenile, although it's not very good for childbirth. But I don't know what the reason was, but we still don't have grandchildren. After that night, seeing how difficult it was for Camilla to talk about it, she tried to avoid the subject. And so they lived taking care of each other. Camilla, who did not listen to her neighbor's refusals, made her porridge in the morning saying, "Anyway, I get up early, and you shouldn't work all day on an empty stomach. Young people need their strength, come on, eat. And I'm eating porridge with you, I can't be the only one cooking it." But one morning Sylvia didn't find the old woman in the kitchen, and the room was suspiciously quiet. The girl felt a certain inner coldness and, knocking on her neighbor's door, she called in a low voice, "Camila Rodriguez, are you asleep?" But there was silence in the room, which made Sylvia's heart beat with terrible force. She was madly scared, but when she opened the door she saw her neighbor in bed and ran to her. But it was too late. When he touched her hand, he immediately pushed it away. It was clear there was nothing he could do to help her. The ambulance doctor on duty pronounced her dead in a distant voice as he walked away. Luckily, he died in his sleep. She did not torture herself, she did not torture others. I fell asleep and the man was gone. It was as if he envied the dead woman. Although at that moment Sylvia herself felt jealous of her. She cried all night, for now she was alone again. At that moment, she wanted to be in her neighbor's place, because at least she had her son, but Sylvia was empty again. Not a soulmate in the whole wide world. But life went on, and she also got up in the morning, only now there was no one to cook porridge for her, and she went to work. Again she did not go back to dinner and tea and talk about the day as she had with Camilla, but to her lonely world in a small room on the outskirts. One day everything changed abruptly. One day, one of the customers, literally from the entrance, made his way to the counter where Sylvia was. With an enigmatic smile he said, "You won't believe it, last night I saw you in a dream. I asked your name and you were so cryptic that you said your name was Laura." Sylvia as if hypnotized. "I'm not Caroline, I'm Sylvia." Apparently, at that moment he realized that he had been deceived, and the stranger smiled happily. He continued enthusiastically, "Well, now I know the name of that beauty, and I am Daniel." He held out his hand to shake, but when Sylvia timidly held out hers in response, he jerked her palm down and kissed her hand as no one had ever kissed her before. What he said next no longer made sense. Sylvia was already in love from the first minutes, because no one had ever said anything like that to her. In the afternoon, he was already waiting outside the store with a bouquet of flowers, and they walked around the night city for a long time. The cheerful boy with black eyes won the heart of the simple villager from the first day, from the first minute. Every day she waited for the workday to end, because she was sure that Daniel was already at the door of the store. They started dating, and after a week he moved in with her and they started living together. Everything seemed to be going well, Daniel was kind and loving. He tried to help around the house. One problem was that he didn't go to work like the others. At every mention of her he tried to avoid the subject. In those moments he kissed Sylvia and said to her, "I don't bring money home or we don't have enough. Honey, I do everything so you don't need anything." But Sylvia felt that she was hiding something. The girl had an uneasy feeling in her soul. He was always hiding something from her, and he could leave in the middle of the night saying, "Honey, it's very important. It's business. I'll tell you in the morning." The girl, not understanding anything, waited for him all night, and in the morning he told her that he had a little job and wanted to rest. In those moments it was impossible to get a word out of him. After these jobs sometimes he came back happy and gave Sylvia gifts and money, but lately he was angry as a dog and for a few days he turned black as a cloud. When he returned, he almost burst into tears and fell to his knees before her, kissing her and speaking frantically, "Sylvia, dear, save me. Help. If it's not you, then no one else, and then they'll just kill me." It turned out that her lover was a gambler, and that's why he used to go out at night, and that's where the money that came into the house sometimes came from. But it turned out that there was much more to lose and that he owed a huge amount of money. When he told her how much he owed her, Sylvia realized that she couldn't earn that much in a year at his store. But she loved Daniel very much and would do anything for him. "I have never had so much money in my life. Even if my parents' house was intact, I could earn a little, but I could sell it, and you know I have nothing and nowhere to get it." Tears ran down the girl's cheeks because of resentment and helplessness. But Daniel immediately said that he had already found out and thought of everything. She immediately began to tell Sylvia how many women have children for others, thus helping unhappy couples condemned to childlessness. Hearing this, she was shocked at how he could calmly suggest such things to her. She couldn't understand how she could give birth to someone she didn't love and sell the child for money. But he knew the pressure. "Of course, it is not you who are killed for your debts. It's no big deal becoming a surrogate to someone else's baby, you hear me, someone else's baby. You will spend your entire pregnancy eating and drinking at someone else's expense, and you will receive a lot of money in advance. I have found out everything. It is enough to pay off the debt and there is still more to spare." Sylvia hesitated for a while, but Daniel managed to convince the village idiot to take the plunge. He even took all organizational matters into his own hands. He quickly found a decent match. Marianne and Pablo, as the future parents were called, were in their early 40s and became friends with Sylvia. As soon as the girl managed to get pregnant through IVF, they surrounded her with care. They bought the best. They rented a nice big apartment in the center of the city. They convinced her to quit her job and have what they said was a positive experience. "I didn't even think it was possible to live like this." The girl slept, walked, knitted, something she hadn't done in a long time. Husband and wife were overjoyed when they found out about the pregnancy and almost immediately paid Sylvia most of the agreed amount. The girl thought that it was Daniel who had tried it and that somehow he had also managed to fool them. The couple hastened to pay almost the entire amount at once, although partial payments had initially been agreed upon. At that moment, Alberto realized that the emotion or the long conversation made the narrator seem tired, so he asked her, "You are tired, why don't you rest and we continue later? I will come to see you and your children more than once." But the girl, as if afraid that she was really going to leave, shook her head negatively and then smiled sadly answering, "No, no, on the contrary, I feel relieved." It had been a long time since he had spoken so frankly with anyone. Probably since Camilla's death. He took a sip of water from the bottle on the nightstand and continued the story. Daniel turned out to be a scoundrel and disappeared the same day as Pablo brought the money. After saying that he would bring the debt and return immediately, he disappeared not only behind the closed door of the apartment, but also from Sylvia's life. But these were not all the difficulties that awaited me on my journey through life. On my first scan, I discovered that she was carrying not one, but 3 babies for the parents-to-be. The couple was even happier to hear the news. The girl smiled as if she remembered what it was like. The couple completely changed Sylvia's wardrobe, who had nothing for winter except a coat and jacket. They bought a fur coat, a lot of dresses, blouses, and other outfits. Marianne enjoyed watching Sylvia try on the costumes, and said, "You should have only the best, because you will give us a lot of happiness." We did not think or guess that we would be parents 3 times at once. At that moment Sylvia interrupted the story and her eyes filled with tears. Alberto could barely contain himself and rushed over to hug her. He was willing to give anything at that moment, so that such a small and fragile woman would not cry again. The doctor no longer thought that it was not his former lover, but a totally different person. Suddenly he realized that he madly loved that fragile and defenseless woman who lay in the hospital bed. At that time Sylvia continued, "It would have been fine, I tried to forget Daniel and go on with my life, but the fact is that 3 months ago Marianne and Pablo disappeared. They stopped coming and they stopped contacting me. I panicked, okay, I would have been left alone, and now I have 3 children on my hands. Luckily they paid for the apartment in advance and I managed to save something. Well, if they've changed their minds about having triplets, I'll raise them somehow. It hurts me, why do all these misfortunes happen to me?" Alberto could barely contain himself and jumped on her to hug her and never let go again. After listening to the girl for almost her whole life, she had already decided that she would never leave her and that she would help her in everything. The next day, when Alberto entered the room, he saw the patient crying by the window. The doctor's heart filled with compassion and he quickly reached out and hugged her. Surprisingly, Sylvia clutched her chest and cried even harder. She cried even more. Calm down, come on," he told her, trying to calm her down. "What happened to make you cry so much? Everything will be fine." But Sylvia, pulling away abruptly and holding back tears, said, "It will not. One of the babies has a heart defect and needs a lot of money to have surgery and recover. Why is this happening to me again?" When she had calmed down a bit, the doctor went to the residence room. There, from Nicolos, the one who attended the delivery, she learned everything about the baby's condition. Back in the room, after the conversation, he promised Sylvia that he would find a solution and they would save the child. In a couple of days, the young mother was to be discharged. Only 2 of the children were ready to be discharged from the hospital, the third had to be under medical supervision before the operation. Every day since he had met Sylvia, Alberto had not been able to think of anything other than her. He couldn't imagine what would happen if he didn't see her for a day, so he decided to be by her side. The day he was discharged, he entered the room in the morning and boldly said, "Sylvia, I know we don't know each other very well, but I really want to help. I ask you and the children to move in with me. I have a beautiful apartment, and the tenants in it are just me and the cat." He smiled sadly and added, "Together it will be easier to deal with children and any problems, and yet I am a doctor, which can be useful more than once." When he finished, he took her hand and looked into her pleading eyes. In those moments was when he was most afraid that she would refuse. Sylvia was silent for a moment and then asked in a low voice, "It must not be comfortable, right? Why do you need such a load?" Alberto was so glad that it was not a refusal, that he squeezed her hand even more and answered in a low voice, "What kind of cargo are you? You are happiness. Perhaps I have waited for this all my life, and for the rest of the why I will surely answer, but at home. Agree?" Sylvia smiled and nodded. At that moment Alberto was the happiest person, because it meant that she would be by his side every morning, afternoon, and day. That same day he happily opened the door of his apartment to the woman who had become his family in such a short time. Well, now this is your house, Alberto said in a low voice, letting her move on. Sorry, there is no nursery yet, but I will redo one of the rooms for the little ones for sure. But Sylvia looked at him with such gratitude that he realized that she would stay even if there was only one room on the floor. At night, after putting the children to bed, they sat in the kitchen and Alberto told them everything from the heart. He began by telling how he had met his sister and how they loved each other. He then sadly told her how his parents had not accepted Caroline, wishing he had a better educated and more prosperous bride. And, of course, he regretted his betrayal. I cannot forgive myself for the fact that then between love and career, I listened to my parents and not my heart. I chose to serve medicine. Maybe if I had married Caroline I would still be alive. He tried to look away so that Sylvia couldn't see the tears that welled up in his eyes. All the while, the girl listened silently, not saying a word. At one point, Alberto came to fear that she would accuse him of all his grave sins and refuse to stay under the same roof as him. But Sylvia listened attentively and put her hand on the man's arm, twisting the teaspoon nervously throughout the evening. She smiled sadly and caressed Alberto's hand so gently that he immediately felt at ease, as if Caroline had truly forgiven him. In surgery, the doctors heard the new family began to turn their heads and whispered behind their backs, they say completely crazy from loneliness. So many single beauties pining for him, and he chose a hick, and to top it off with 3 children. But Alberto didn't care about gossip. He had already realized that he was in love and would do anything for Sylvia and the children. Her main task now was to help the sick baby, but she did not know how. He needed a lot of money and there was nowhere to get it. At some point it literally dawned on me. When he returned from work, he told Sylvia from the door, I know someone who can help us with the money for the operation. I have a patient that I once saved. He is an excellent detective. I already told you about him, he was the one who found out everything about Caroline and her death for me. Seeing the girl's puzzled look, he didn't let her wake up and continued, I will ask him to find your missing businessmen. Even if they change their minds to take the children, I think they won't refuse to help us save one of them. The detective was glad to meet a new savior, and learning that his search could save someone's life, he quickly found all the information he needed. It just didn't bring joy to anyone. The fact was that the couple had not only been missing for 3 months. Something irreparable had happened. That day there was terrible ice and Pablo, unable to stand driving, spun and went into the opposite lane. The driver of the truck they hit didn't even have time to brake. The businessman's car and his wife were literally smeared on the road, there was no chance to save them. After listening to Andre, Alberto was perplexed, he was already thinking about how to tell Sylvia, but the detective continued, Doctor, it's not that bad. There is an opportunity, like the one I once had. The fact is that Pablo had elderly parents and they were the ones who had inherited all the fortune of their deceased son. He handed me a piece of paper with an address. It's not far from here, in the village of the cabins, do you want me to take you? There was no time to lose, we had to save the baby and take every opportunity we could. They immediately went to the address on the piece of paper. Instead of expecting to see a huge mansion with guards and cameras waiting for them, there was a very neat 2-story house, with a solid wooden fence and the most ordinary gate, without codes or guards. Ringing the doorbell, hung from an obviously weatherproof awning, they saw the porch light come on. Who can't stay home at night? They heard the voice of a disgruntled man. It was late afternoon and the sun had dipped below the horizon when they reached the town. Alberto was surprised at first, but when the door opened he said confidently, Good evening, excuse me for God's sake, we have to talk about your grandson. One of the grandsons to be exact. Even in the dead of night you could see the old man's face change as he greeted them. He swallowed saliva, and with a trembling but severe voice he said, Who are you? Scammers? Extortionists? So you are in the wrong place. Let's go from here. Our son couldn't have children, and he certainly didn't send them to us from the other side. He was about to leave, but Alberto quickly started talking about the surrogate mother, about Eco, and how she had been left without protection or means with 3 children, one of whom needs an operation. The old man listened in silence, and just as Severe said, "Come in, but first I'll tell my wife, we'll sit in the kitchen and then, God willing her heart bear this news, we'll decide what to do next." Andre and Alberto sat in silence, certain that, God forbid, if something happened, they would help immediately. But, after all, the old men were always different. Quickly, after about 10 minutes, Pablo's parents came out and sat at the table facing the guests. The woman was the first to start the conversation, trying to stay calm. "No one told us about the idea of having someone else's children, as Pablo had always hoped to surprise them. But life had decided otherwise." Her husband interrupted her and told her more calmly than when we met, "There is no doubt that we will help the child with the operation and treatment, but we have to make sure that they are the children of Marianne and Pablo." Andre joined the conversation. "Of course, tomorrow we will bring all the documents, receipts, and proofs that the mothers of the children have. And you can do the expertise at any time." The money for the boy's operation was already in the account that night, so the next afternoon the boy had already been transferred from the operating room to the intensive care unit. Sylvia and Alberto took turns visiting the boy and even brought the newborn grandparents to see their recently rescued grandson. To everyone's surprise, the strong-looking and domineering grandfather was the first to shed a tear, while his wife merely wiped it away carefully. After the hospital, Alberto suggested that they visit him and meet the other grandchildren. After some hesitation, the parents finally agreed. An hour later, they had their grandson and granddaughter in their arms and were crying with happiness. When leaving that day, Pablo's mother, Marie Gibras, approached Sylvia and hugged her. "Thank you, dear, dear. You brought my grandfather and me back to life. We are old enough to take responsibility for raising our grandchildren, but I beg you, do not deprive us of communication with them. We, for our part, we will help you in everything. We thought we were alone in the world, Pablo was the only thing we had." Sylvia thanked him for helping the boy and promised to bring him back whenever possible. And so it happened. She and Alberto began to visit them regularly and brought their grandchildren with them. When they were a bit older, Alberto used to bring the rowdy trio around for the whole weekend at Marie's request. They would turn the whole house upside down, as Happy Grandfather said, and kiss their grandfather and grandmother goodbye. When the children were 1 year old, Alberto proposed to Sylvia and she, shy as a schoolgirl, replied, "Of course I agree, where can we go without you?" She pressed against his chest with such force that Alberto almost suffocated. It wasn't so much the strength of his embrace as his love for her. They decided to marry quietly, without fuss or friends, in a small circle, and after the wedding they limited themselves to a village of rural houses, especially since the noisy trio had to stay at their grandparents' house during the registration. The day before the wedding, Sylvia, hugging her beloved, asked, "And your parents? They are alive? Why don't you ever talk about them?" Alberto said that he rarely called them to see if they were okay and healthy, but communication was tense. She couldn't forgive them for their separation and then Caroline's death. After listening to him, the fragile but very intelligent Sylvia said, "My dear, you must forgive them and invite them to join us. After all, they have no idea that they will now be grandparents like Pablo's parents." Alberto thought about Sylvia's words and, deep down, agreed with her. But it was very difficult to take that step after so many years of strained relations. In life, it turned out that the main thing was to take the first step. His parents only found out about the wedding and 3 grandchildren, and the next day they were already at the door. From the first minutes, they found common ground with everyone, and Alberto was surprised at how much loneliness had changed them. After a couple of hours, grandfather and grandfather were talking, as they said. The grandmothers, for their part, were like eagles running after their grandchildren every minute, wiping away their tears, sobs, and jokes. Alberto and Sylvia calmly went to the reception, where Andre, the detective, and his girlfriend were the witnesses. When they returned, a table had been set up in the street, under a shop, with delicacies prepared by the grandmothers, and the new grandfathers were working the tasty meat by the fire. The children fell asleep at night, barely touching the pillow, and the adults sat outside for a long time, and it seemed that these people were very close and loved each other very much. When the evening was coming to an end, Samuel, Pablo's father, got up and said with a sure voice, "Well, we are grateful that our children have managed to do something so important and necessary for us, the elders. Alberto, Sylvia, thank you very much for entering our lives. Now you are like our own children for us, and our grandchildren are ours." Taking a sip of juice from the glass that was on the table, he continued, "My wife and I have discussed everything, and we have decided that we have to think about the future of the three Tombos, and we have left them a will for everything we have and everything we inherit from our children. So we believe that they have enough to live on. The main thing is that you raise them as smart and correct people like you." When the father finished, Alberto got up, looked enigmatically at the table and said, "Well, since we are spending such a solemn day and afternoon of revelations, Sylvia and I also want to say that, after thinking about it, we have decided that where there are three, there will be 4 children to enjoy." "Yes, darling?" Sylvia smiled happily, kissed her husband and answered, "Yeah, honey, it looks like we're having a girl, so our family score will be 2-2. After this news, the grandparents had tears of joy in their eyes and for some reason began to congratulate each other, not the young. If you liked the story, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel.